It's day 329. It's also March 30th, 2020, and we're in Delta, Colorado. You ever wake up in the morning and ask yourself, what am I doing? And more importantly, why? Yeah, me too. Hi, my name's Craig, and this is my story. A story about life. Life out there. For visuals while listening, search Life Out There on your favorite social media platform or use the links in the podcast description. So the calendar may be in the middle of turning the page on winter, but the Arkansas Valley and western slope regions of Colorado, well, it feels like they got a different calendar. We ended up spending 3 nights in Rocky Ford, tucked away in the Arkansas Valley Fairgrounds, watching Mother Nature change her mind more than a couple times, before giving us the all clear, sort of. And that drive through Arkansas Valley unfolds across the southeast region of Colorado, revealing a broad range of scenery. The wide-open ranch and farmlands dotted with wind turbine farms that had brought us into Rocky Ford from Kansas, well, they continue at first along Highway 50, but briefly. Passing through Manzanola and Fowler, landscape shifted quickly and had us rolling through the foothills of Monarch Pass in no time. As we passed through Pueblo West, and Canyon City, there were vast variances in the lay of the land. The grand scale of the Rocky Mountains showing up on the horizon, providing an immense backdrop. This being our first time entering Colorado from the east, it was as if we had just met Colorado for the first time. The Rockies, majestic and still blanketed in snow. And given the time of year we're making the trek, they can feel a bit intimidating. But yet, they somehow opened up, reached out, and welcomed us into a universe that would be literally a polar opposite of where we had just left. The whole experience took me back to those Saturday ski trips in Washington, leaving the urban landscapes of Tacoma, but in no time passing through the rainy farmlands and cattle ranches of rural Auburn, and then, just 20 miles or so up the road, a winter wonderland awaits at the Crystal Mountains ski area in those Cascade Mountains. And probably one of the coolest discoveries as we rolled through this area, the Arkansas Headwaters National Recreation Area and the Royal Gorge. It looks like no matter what you're looking for in the great outdoors. Some hiking, zipline tours, world-class whitewater rafting and fishing, or just a drive through some of the most rugged country Colorado has to offer. You can find it here, and surrounded with views that photos just don't capture. Another area that we need to come back to when spring and summer have taken control. Oh, and minus a pandemic, everything we saw, closed. And Monarch Pass, well, that was still flirting with winter as well, threatening the occasional snow flurry, but thankfully, roads were clear and traffic was light. Slow and steady being the rule. We dropped down off the pass and through a smattering of small communities before reaching Salida. And coming out of the mountains, things flatten out quite a bit, and our snowy surroundings were replaced with yet more evidence that frigid temperatures were not yet done with this part of the universe. The pine-covered mountains had been replaced with pinnacles, all these rock formations, and still frozen lakes, and the rivers alongside us that had just barely shed their icy, wintry skin. Mother Nature's definitely calling the shots around here, and it'll be a while before a boat launches on Lake Sapanero. And something tells me that all this scenery takes on a whole different look when you're doing the looking from a boat on that lake. The final leg of today's drive down off that pass would take us through a place called Gunnison. And we probably would have stopped in Gunnison for the night. It's a cool place. I've been here a few times. Skiing with friends at the Crested Butte Ski Resort, an awesome little community just outside town. But the town certainly is worth exploring outside of the skiing opportunities. A mining and ranching community that plays host to the nation's fourth oldest rodeo each year. And I hear it's got a pretty awesome pioneer museum as well. But yet one more time, this pandemic had gotten in the way of our adventure. Gunnison had placed a digital sign just outside town making it very clear that Gunnison was closed for business, COVID-19. So we trek another 80 miles or so to Delta. Well, technically Delta, that is. Figuring the place was shut down like everywhere else, we'd find ourselves a dirt road before even entering town and wander out into BLM land in search of our address for the night. And it wasn't until after a walk with Dougie and dinner that my phone would proclaim Delta, Colorado, when I asked where we were. Apparently, we'd gotten close enough. The internet would go on to tell me that Delta, a community of 9,000 or so in the western slope region of the state, was an area rich in agriculture and natural beauty, surrounded by the Rocky Mountains. Duh, I thought. I didn't need the phone to tell me that. We're looking at it. But as I read a little more, one of the next things to come up, Delta is a home rule municipality? Well, not having a clue what that meant, I'd already started reading about it when, thank goodness, I had a flashback. Shelton, Washington, last May, when I read that Shelton has a council-manager form of government and was the last city in Washington to use a mayor-commission form of government. I'd remembered trying to understand the difference between the two, why a town would choose one over the other, and blah, blah, blah. But mostly, I remembered that I promised myself that if I ever read anything again about a city or town's form of government, I'd skip it. Just not my thing. So, I skipped it. Well, almost. The term home rule was such an odd term being applied to a city, in my mind, that I had to at least try to understand what that meant. And essentially, I guess it means that under the state's constitution, Delta has opted for this form of government, which apparently gives the town a bit more autonomy when it comes to setting local law and policy, as opposed to simply adhering to state practices and laws. That all sounded to me like a version of how most every city and town in the country runs. So enough. I skipped it. Kinda. It was way more interesting to learn that this region of Colorado, at the confluence of the Uncompahgre and Gunnison rivers, was Ute stomping grounds when it came to Native American presence, and that it would be those Spanish explorers that trekked across the region having first contact with those Native Americans. And a lucrative trade relationship would ultimately lead to the establishment of Fort Uncompahgre, a trading post here in the late 1800s by a French-Canadian trapper. And just like most everywhere else in the country, the Native Americans here were trading those valuable furs, some making their way across not only this continent, but showing up in Europe as well. In exchange, the Native Americans were stocking up on horses, guns, and iron products. And that was life in Delta, Colorado, and beyond, for a couple of centuries, until mining and the settlement era came to this part of the world. Here in Delta, gold would be discovered, which led to, well, we've read that story too, dozens of times, from Oregon to Arizona, New Mexico to Idaho, and most everywhere we've been. Life was good. For everyone, for a very long time. And then, life got way better. For some. But it took a turn in the other direction. For many others. Here in Delta, it would be that discovery of gold, round about the time the Indian Wars were coming to a close. And as the Ute people were being rounded up by the thousands and forced to move to reservations in Utah as part of the U.S. Forced Relocation Program, the tales of the fertile soils and gold-lined rivers had settlers and wannabe miners flocking to the area from all across the southeast portion of the country. But gold mining in the area turned out to be a bit more elusive than early arrivals had hoped. So as many moved on to bigger gold rushes further out there in the west and on the west coast, even more would decide that this was the perfect spot to stay put and make a life farming and ranching alongside these rivers against that backdrop of the Rocky Mountains. And once the railway had made it to the area, even more eager settlers would arrive, and the area was off and running. And they haven't really ever looked back. In the next few years, these settlers would learn that the fertile soils at the delta of those two rivers, which is how the name would come to be, would grow most anything you wanted. From oats and wheat and barley, alfalfa, apples, peaches, and grapes. Why would you go anywhere else, they thought. And by this time, the over 800 residents of Delta had decided they were home, for good. And there are some pretty telling indicators of life here in Delta at the time. Those 800 residents, well, they enjoyed access to one general store and one drugstore. But it would take 5 saloons, 5 lawyers, and 2 doctors to meet the rest of the town's needs. And the town would go on to become the county seat because of its strategic location along that growing railway system. And then, in the late 1800s, Delta would make national news, proving that along with all its prosperity, the town was still about as wild as the Wild West could get. The McCarty gang would roll into town and choose one of the town's 2 banks in an attempt to help themselves to some of that prosperity. Well, it didn't work out so well for the McCartys. 2 of the 3 would be killed in a gun battle as they attempted escape. The 3rd? Well, he'd disappear into history, never being heard from again. And there's always that one more click thing. I was finishing up reading and writing just after that last walk with Dougie. I was reviewing the photos I'd taken today when I was reminded of that freeway exit sign that we'd passed. Pueblo, Colorado, and the Pueblo Chemical Depot. So I asked the internet. It's a 23,000-acre facility, built and designed to destroy the U.S. stockpile of chemical weapons. There are only 2 such facilities in the country. The other is located in Richmond, Kentucky. And I couldn't read a sentence like the U.S. stockpile of chemical weapons without reading more, right? Specifically, it seems we're referring to mustard gas. Its origins date back to 1860, when a British chemist first synthesized the gas. It was named for its color and an aroma that was vaguely similar to that of a mustard plant. Now, obviously, this British guy was not trying to invent chemical warfare. He was just a scientist, exploring different chemical elements and seeing how they interacted with one another. But once it was discovered that this liquid gas, when dispersed into the air, the small droplets formed would cause severe blistering of the skin and mucous membranes in humans. And it was only a matter of time before man would figure out the delivery mechanism enabling its use in war. And fast forward to World War I. The Germans would be the first to deploy the weaponry. But the Allies, including the U.S., were not far behind. Before long, the chemical had found its way to artillery shells, bombs, even rockets. The primary objective of its use was not to kill, but to incapacitate soldiers and civilians alike, It caused severe chemical burns, respiratory damage, even temporary blindness, making it a feared weapon in the battlefields across Europe. It also overwhelmed medical facilities with the wounded, which allowed the military that had deployed the weapon a tactical advantage when moving into the areas that they had just bombed with the stuff. Now, the civilized world, for the most part, upon seeing the horrific effects of the gas in mass scale, on both soldiers and civilians, well, they decide by 1925 to sign the Geneva Gas Protocol, which called for the prohibition of chemical and biological weapons. The intent may have been to discontinue its use, but guess what? Man, conflict, and war? Well, we never really seem to get around to undoing the bad things we've done, on purpose or not. Its use continues to be documented across the globe, and my guess is I could spend an eternity trying to figure out exactly where Iran or Iraq or Syria or North Korea or Russia got this stuff, continue to have access to it, and further develop this kind of weaponry, and still not get to the bottom of things. And just like each and every other one of my discoveries, this one, I could tell, would take me down a rabbit hole I might never come out of. So for now, what I know for sure is that this chemical depot in Colorado and the one in Kentucky are working to safely dispose of the entire U.S. stockpile of chemical weaponry, with a planned completion date of 2023. It's gonna get chilly again tonight. Supposed to drop down to just above freezing. But it looks like another sunny and almost 60-degree day tomorrow. And sitting in a grassy prairie here in Colorado, seemingly so quiet, but yet wondering, did Native Americans die here, battling to keep their homeland? Did U.S. cavalry and settlers die here, trying to take it? Did railway workers sweat into these soils during the expansion era of these United States? And did bank robbers run through here with bags of ill-gotten gains? Probably. And whose historic path might we cross tomorrow, hundreds of years after the fact, as we continue our drive back to and deeper into Colorado's western slope? I guess we'll see tomorrow. And I wonder what we'll learn there. Turns out, this thing called life comes with a lot of rules. Maybe it's time to break a few. Because you can. No, seriously, you can.